last 12 years that a lot of you have come to expect from me, a fantasy story about chickens, or a childhood adventure, or, of course, this last year, a theological treatise on chickens. But I want to be very serious with you this time.
Yeah, right.
I thought this was a trusting group that would take what I would have to say with sensitivity, to treat it with honesty and
That's so cute, Larry.
confidentiality.
What convention did you think?
Learn different, didn't you?
Isn't this Aviary Anonymous?
The cat show is next door.
Okay.
Well,
Anyway.
as you well know, I've had this fondness for chickens, and it's a haunting question all my life. Now, there are some things that are true. It is true that we raise chickens, white-legged chickens, through my childhood and adolescence. That is true. It is also true that I conducted a series of experiments with chicken power. That is true. It is true that some of my best friends during my childhood and adolescence, were chickens. That is true. Now, those things are all true. I know I've told you stories about that. Now, I'm trying to think back, but what is it that into my mature adulthood that I'm still attracted to chickens? Well, one thing I thought about was indeed my childhood. Now, my parents were normal, average, working-class folk. There wasn't any particular issues I had with my parents, but I was the oldest of 4 children. Now, as many of you know who are older children, the first child is the disciplinary experiment. The younger children never get the same punishment. They always have life easy. And when you're the oldest child, you're usually let out on your own early. You're assumed to be older, mature, responsible. You can make decisions, and not sheltered like the younger children were. So I suspect that I was 4 years old when my first sister was born, and they went on for another 10 years. I know that I felt that way, that I was sort of isolated in my older development as the oldest child. So it was the chickens to whom I turned for companionship and relationship. You know how sensitively a chicken looks at you. They're listening. They have to turn their head just a bit to listen. But because they're not binocular, they only have one good eye that they can focus on you. So there's an intensity in that relationship. And as you know from stories that I've told before, chickens can learn to cooperate. And they do accept occasionally. We've heard stories about that, accepting kittens. So I felt a degree of companionship and acceptance with the chickens. And that relationship was important, I suppose. But you know, all of you probably at some point have wondered about your parents. Now, I know when I was young, the question, are they really my parents? Was I adopted? That comes up occasionally, and it did for me. I think that's normal. At one point I thought, well, if I was adopted, then they could just as easily get rid of me as they took me in. Or a band of gypsies could come along and they could sell me. But there was a kind of a security that I held with my flock. Well, those are all normal things, but I have to tell you that a number of years ago, and I'm not sure if it was coincidental with the beginning of the Chicken Festival, but I began to have some serious, and this is why, I'm sorry, Anthony, I wanted this to be serious. I've had some psychological trauma. Linda can testify, I've developed restless leg syndrome at night. There have been times that I've had a neck problem, and I've got to have chiropractic treatment to get that straightened out. And I've had a shoulder issue. I think it's a rotor cuff, but there are times in the night that my sleep is interrupted. I'm not getting enough rest, and I began to have flashbacks of nightmares of chickens. Talked about chicken fear. Those kind of things have been happening more frequently. I've had an aversion to axes. Just the other day, someone was wringing out a cloth at the sink, and I was very nervous about that. And these things have been getting more and more intense, and I haven't quite figured that out. Well, I hadn't up until about a year ago. But I have to tell you, and this is really a testimonial to some of the excellent psychological training that we've been experiencing in this country recently. I was able to go to a therapist who did understand my situation. And I'm here to testify to you today that there is such a thing as repressed memory. Or indeed, my therapist was able to dip into my past and to bring back to me memories that I had seated so deeply into my very being itself, that once those stories began to happen, many of those symptoms that I've told you began to go away. I was able to recover the summer of 1957. I was 8 years old. Now, you have to know that I was a little smaller and smarter than my age. I went to kindergarten at 4 years old, and so all the way through school, I had folks in my class that were a full year older than I. And for boys, that's an issue, because you're not maturing at the same rate, and you're always behind. And so I remember that the summer that I was 8 years old was one of those difficult transition periods that I wasn't quite up to the sports ability of some of my peers. But the incident that was conjured up amidst all of the bad feelings I had about my summer when I was 8 years old, that I did not remember until therapeutic sessions. My grandfather's sister, who lived in Colorado, Aunt Annie, was very ill. And my parents and my grandparents decided they would go out to Boulder, Colorado and help great Uncle Lucy with Annie's care. And so we're to leave, I and my sister, in our home in Nebraska with a babysitter.